Welcome, welcome, welcome. Truly a privilege. I've been looking forward to this for a while. We've talked for a while. I've been reading this person's work for a while. He is as tuned into the topics that I'm looking into. With us, it's Duncan Moench. I got this right. Duncan is right.
Pretty close. Yeah, Moench. Yes.
Okay, because I looked it up. I was like, you can be a mensch.
Right.
And be a mensch. And it's an old Yiddish term, last used primarily in the 1960s, meaning a person of integrity and high honor, someone to admire, emulate, or someone of noble character.
Hey, we'll take it. That's not what the German actually means, monk. But you pronounce it. We pronounce it.
I'll just start looking this up to try to impress you. Okay.
That's okay.
You're fired.
That's okay.
Yeah, there's no staff. But,
no, I mean, originally it should be spelled with an umlaut, but it means monk in German. But it's better for people to just think of the Yiddish Mensch because it helps people remember it better, helps people pronounce it correctly. It's a very hard name to pronounce.
So you could be a monk or a person of high integrity, scholar. Both are good.
We'll do what I'll take it,
Yeah. Technically, as I'm informed from your website, you're known as a writer, scholar, and multimedia producer. You're currently a research fellow at Heterodox Academy in New York, which is a great institution. I studied a lot of their interviews, especially under Chris Martin, I think was his name, in New York, as well as Tablet Magazine's social critic at large and contributing writer at County Highway Magazine. Actually, County Highway considers themselves a newspaper, and their tagline is America's only newspaper. Dr. Moench.
That's right. Only.
That's right. Only newspaper left. I kind of agree. Dr. Moench has lectured widely, including teaching 12 different higher education courses across 6 different academic disciplines. He's currently writing a book on anti-socialist nativism and the ethnopolitics in the American liberal tradition with the University Press of Kansas, and is represented by the DeRipost Literary Agency. Very impressive. Previously, he created the Keep It Civil podcast for Arizona State University. Really, that's the other one I primarily did my research on. That one and Heterodox Academy informed a lot of what I was doing before I even got started. Wow, and you did both. I didn't know that. Arizona PBS, as well as the Arizona PBS, was another one that I... That's 3, because I found a lot of people weren't doing the quality level of research that I wanted. And I found Heterodox Academy, Arizona PBS, and there was the Keeping It Civil podcast did. That's ironic. The other one was the Niskanen Center podcast. So you got 3 out of 4. Wow. Well as Life of the Mind podcast for the University of Texas at Austin. Again, Moench. That's the way we'll go with it. PhD in American Studies. It's a subset of American history. I might ask you about that a little bit more. I found it fascinating. We talked earlier. Taught at 4 universities. He's also lived and traveled in 9 U.S. states: Utah, New Jersey, New York, Texas, Arizona, Oregon. He's also lived in a foreign country, Canada. He's written 4 articles on national separation. Started writing them the week after George Floyd. American Conflicts, the New Civil War. Americans Hate Each Other, The Great American Breakup, and there's another one. We'll get to that in a second. He also predicted Donald Trump would be the next president before he was nominated and during his initial appearance, largely before America and even myself knew. He also predicted Trump will win again and California will lose it. As I told him, that's what Calix is saying. He worked at Air America Radio. This is the part I loved when we were initially talking. He was there when left-wing news turned into straight partisans. While Rachel Maddow was there, he was seeing how traditional media was being turned into partisan media. He was there when they wanted to create a left version of Fox News. He felt the people who worked in these newsrooms were completely disconnected from the real American people and had no interest to get to know them. That's why I predicted Trump would win when the media said Trump would lose, because he knew America and the liberal media had no idea what the middle of America was. His whole adult life, he's been trying to figure out what America is. Once you understand that, you will see there's no possible way to reform it. I'll ask you about that in a minute. Has found that American political culture as an area of study is not well studied by anyone. And American political thought is policed by right-wing academics the way social studies are policed by left-wing academics. Feels it's actually easy to break up the country into regional nations. Feels it's obvious America's not a democracy now. He's interviewed many scholars on political polarization, and he's also an editor for Tablet magazine. We're going to talk about these articles.
Well, actually, I don't do any editing. I'm just a writer. I mean,
we'll get rid of that. No longer an editor.
Okay.
Okay, he's gone. Well, actually, before we go into the articles, how did I do on the bio? Is there anything I got wrong? Is there something?
Yeah, no. That's all. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff.
Okay.
I don't know if any of it's particularly impressive, but I mean, it's all accurate.
Well, for me, it is because I don't know if I want to get into it right away, but I find this is not a well-studied topic by serious scholars. There's a few people doing it, and then there's a lot of, and I'm trying to get the book out, and I talked about it, interviewed 200 professors. There's a lot of people who are saying, it's not that bad. It'll be fine. We've dealt with bad stuff. Even this week or last week, they secretly recorded 2 Supreme Court justices at an event. And the news is talking about, it was Roberts and Alito. And the news is talking about how Alito said some stuff about how he has a conservative world vision.
Right.
What grabbed me and made me very sad was that the news completely missed the larger story. So Alito said, yeah, I have a conservative world opinion. He also said, it's not working anymore. The system isn't working. It's come down to one side against the other, and one side is going to beat the other side. And that's just the way it is. One of the top legal officials in all of America said, the system no longer works. It's come down to a brute force match, and one side will definitely force their way on the other. That was largely ignored. It was largely seen as, well, that's just your opinion. In return, Roberts was celebrated for saying, there's no real problem. Things are fine.
I don't know. I'm not sure how much to make out of conversations that are recorded clandestinely.
Fair enough.
With some stranger, but at the same time, I mean, everyone is ignoring a lot of very profound signs that things are not going well, and of course, there's people want to hand wring about January 6th or Trump's etiquette or whatever hell else they are permanently fixated on, so they don't have to talk about serious things. But obviously, our system is approaching its tail end of functionality, and I think that's the part that most people don't want to openly discuss. And obviously, as you said before, kind of in the introduction, my position is it's broken. It's better to acknowledge that something's broken earlier rather than later. So for instance, if something critical, in terms of the components on your house are broken, you're much better off fixing a small part of your roof that's starting to leak than ignore it, right? I mean, that should be fairly obvious. And if you don't, the whole thing's going to cave in, and you have no idea how much the damage could actually be. You could lose an entire portion of the roof. You could lose multiple floors. The entire house could end up being, compromised. And I think that's where we are, where it isn't that the roof, to continue with this metaphor, is leaking. The question of whether or not it's leaking. We know it's leaking. Things are not going well. Things are not functioning. I mean, if you were to come up with a list of American institutions that are functioning well, what would be on the list?
I saw a survey on this, and apparently the only federal institution that Americans have faith in is the military. Whether that's deserved or not.
That's a maybe, though, right? Because at the same time, they're constantly lobbying for us to get involved in wars that are minimum questionable, like Ukraine. Like, should we really be involved in Ukraine? They're almost inevitably going to lose this war. I mean, you don't tend to get involved with wars with Russia. It doesn't tend to work out very well, with the small exception of Afghanistan. what are we doing there? And think of the gigantic ramifications when they finally do lose the war that the U.S. and most of Western Europe is backing. And all you have to do is just look at all of the recent agreements that Putin's managed to solidify. So this has not weakened him at all. Like, put aside anything else, like just in terms of their goals, they're not accomplishing their goals. Like try to think of a number of things that American elites, the people who actually run things in this country, are successful at. And then if you try to come up with a list of things where they exhibit care for everyday people and come up with programs that actually function to accomplish goals that most of the people in the country want, what would be on those lists? You would really struggle to come up with even a handful of things, if you could even come up with them. I mean, I can't necessarily even think of anything. Think of the housing market, for instance. That American housing is more unaffordable than any period of time that we've ever had. Okay, that's not hyperbole, because this is a country that used to have a frontier where you could literally go and settle on unclaimed land. Okay, so it's not like you can look in the past and say there's some secret period of time where housing was more affordable than it is now. That's nonsense. It is the most unaffordable that it's ever been. Okay, so this is basic living quarters, okay, and a huge component of the American dream. Does anybody have a coherent plan of what to do? No, it's frankly just entirely ignored and hoped that it will get better somehow through sticking our head in the sand. And that's pretty much how they deal with practically everything. So same with higher education, for instance. Higher education is more expensive than it's ever been. People get less out of the degrees than they ever have. Try to think of a part of higher education that isn't in total disaster. Like, okay, maybe if you're at the tip top of the profession, like a dean or a university president, yeah, those people are probably doing pretty well. Like, they probably make more money than they ever have. Okay, besides those people, who's doing well in higher education? Not the students, not the people graduating with PhDs, not anybody seeking actual stability in the job market. Okay, the students are absolutely less served by the system than they've ever been. So who's it functioning for, right? Like these institutions, for the most part, same with healthcare. Okay, is healthcare worse than it's ever been? Probably. I mean, it probably was worse before Obamacare. Obamacare kind of put a Band-Aid on some of the issues, but it's mainly just served to be a buttress to corporate America and the gigantic insurance companies who are making, I think, I could be wrong about this, but it doesn't necessarily matter if it's not precise. Are they making more money than they've ever have? I would say probably. I don't know the stats on the top of my head, but I think so. And if they're not, it's definitely close to as much as they ever have. Whereas costs are higher than they've ever been for everyday people. You're still wrestling with insurance companies over bullshit. Frankly, you still can't get the. I'm trying to get an MRI at the moment on my back. They just disapprove things all the time for ridiculous reasons, make you run through red tape. We pay more for our healthcare. We get the worst outcomes. I mean, so let's go down the list. Our political system, almost everybody left and right agrees is if it's not fundamentally broken, everyone's going to agree that it's approaching broken. It's certainly corrupt. Our healthcare system is corrupt and near total breakdown, okay? Because at a certain point, like, this system can no longer go on. People can't pay the premiums. People are literally dying at a younger age than any other wealthy industrialized country in the world. Higher education is more expensive than it's ever been. Housing is more expensive than it's ever been. And yet most of the discussion is about things that are meaningless. So you have to try and figure out, okay, if you have a nation where most of the institutions are this non-functional, and we're comparing that functionality based off of previous eras, right? Like, so it's not just out of the blue.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah. Like I don't think you necessarily want to say like, okay, are we less functional than like India or something? Okay. Like, but here's the thing. In a way, that's kind of what's happening. America's becoming India. That's actually what I would say is like the analog. And weirdly, I think that's what a lot of wealthy elites and people, at high places in corporate America actually kind of want America to be. They want as many people to come into the country as possible so they can have this gigantic pool of low-wage labor. And that doesn't just affect low-wage jobs. It affects middle-class jobs also. Then they want to make the housing almost as unaffordable as possible because it doesn't affect them. Like if you're a millionaire, you're a billionaire. All you have to do is look at modern New York. Who lives in modern New York? I mean, and I travel to multiple. I don't live there because I can't afford to live there.
Right. No one can.
No one can afford to live there unless you're extraordinarily wealthy or an obscene risk taker. Like, I mean, you can just feel it when you walk around New York. Everyone is rich except for the homeless people, right? And the servants that they have that are working at the CVS and the restaurants and everything else. Everyone is rich. So for the people at the top of the food chain, things are going well for them. And so you were saying that a lot of the professors you interview about this, so if they're full professors, they're doing well. If you're a full professor or you're a tenured professor, you're doing well. You're probably already vested in the housing market. You've got a job with tenure. Once you get tenure, you get these automatic raises. You're there. You've got some stability. It's pretty hard to get fired, although you can be fired these days. But still, if you put your head down and you're careful, you are invested in the system. So of course, people like that are going to say things. They're motivated to think, oh, this will probably work its way out, right? Oh, that leak in the roof's not so bad. It's not so bad. There's no reason to freak out. There's no reason to absolutely go with their total reevaluation of how we're doing things.
That makes all the sense in the world. That I've been struggling with this for a year. Like, what do you, because I would talk to professors and I'd be like, we've had tough times. We had the 1960s, we had Vietnam, we had the Civil War, we'll get over it. And I go, January 6th, never had that before. Oh, it's not that bad. Yeah, but come on. I'm like, you're a PhD. And I'm not encouraging people to, I think that's just unethical to present yourself as something that you're not in order to get a recording from Supreme Court justices. I don't agree with that. What bothered me was that Roberts said, everything's fine. It's fine. We've been through Vietnam. We've been through the Civil War. Things aren't that bad. Polarization's not that bad. It's fine. We'll get through it. Totally poo-pooed the idea, totally downplayed it like there's nothing wrong here. And then Alito goes, at least, yeah, it's that bad. And I'm like, Roberts was celebrated as the wise one. And I go, is that wise to say there's no problem? There's no polarization. We're not near the worst levels.
Well, I think polarization is actually one of the smaller problems. I mean, I think the polarization is a problem to a certain extent. But it's not that's mainly the frame that the people who are in control would like people to believe is the problem. The real problem is the fact that they do not care at all about trying to create a middle class and sustain a middle class. Okay, so this country used to be built off of not only middle class structures, but middle class values. Okay, so you have two things. Let's talk structures that allow for a middle class existence. So economic structures, things like all the legislation passed after World War II. Okay, the GI Bill, things that allowed people to get into houses. All right, so you had this era in American history during the New Deal era, especially, where there was this emphasis that we need to take care of the average American. We need to create a structure where the middle class American and even the working poor can have a decent existence. That's why you have things like Social Security, so old people don't die in total poverty. Okay, this is why you have things like even Medicaid. Okay, so poor people can have some form of medical insurance, right? And then you had an era where, and this isn't like some kind of left-wing radical position, all right, to where the first president in the United States to not actively have contempt for labor unions is Franklin Roosevelt. Okay.
Right.
And he wasn't even pro labor union. And again, this isn't like a non-mainstream position. This is Richard Hofstadter's position written in the American political tradition, which was literally a textbook in high schools in the 1950s. Okay. So his position was Franklin Roosevelt is the first president to not have active contempt for labor unions. And not that he was pro-labor union, he just didn't have contempt for them and he was willing to work for them. So you see this massive organizing boon that happens during not only the 1930s and the 40s when Roosevelt was president, but it continues on and it has some tailwinds even into the 1970s, although I think the marker of the early 80s is when the labor union rates start to go down. And during this whole New Deal era, you have this massive birth of the middle class, right? Which is, almost by everyone's measure, the true heyday of not only American middle class existence, but even the country itself. Okay, so then you have people who are in charge, the business elite, let's call them, for lack of a better word, who also have incredible power inside Washington, who basically decide we don't want to do that anymore. We don't actually want to pay fair wages. Right. We don't want to do that. We don't have to do that. We can create a different structure where we import cheap goods from other places that will kind of buttress people's incomes, will reduce the amount that we pay, not only to produce things by shipping it overseas, but then we can have this kind of low wage system that's buttressed by cheap goods from elsewhere. And that's the system that they create that we're still living in now. And the longer it goes on, the more the middle class will start to basically become non-existent. And they don't care. I mean, that's the part that is the real main story of what should concern everyone, is that the people running things, and they're not really different, honestly, than the people who ran things. It's slightly different, but that we can get into that if you want. But they do not care about creating a middle class world. That is not a priority to them. And it, as a function, it's disappearing, and it's only going to continue to erode.
It reminds me of, I'm putting this up right now. There was a speech in the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. You'll own nothing and be happy.
Right. Yeah.
They actually caught someone on video saying that at the Economic Forum.
Well, I'm unclear on whether or not that was, sort of critical. Was it critical of that position or not? I mean, I actually haven't read the obviously it's inspired a lot of criticism, but was that original speech a critique of this platform or not? I'm unclear, but then again, fair. I haven't looked at it.
Fair. And
I don't know. I just think uttering that phrase though illustrates that is the model. And you see this in the housing market where these massive corporations have come in, they're buying up houses with the sole purpose of either holding them as investments because they know they're going to go up by a certain percentage, a very high percentage per year, or they're renting them out, which means they're making even more money off of it. And it's a pretty basic thing that we should be passing at minimum state laws, but really federal laws to ban these practices. I mean, why in the world do we need to let a gigantic corporation own a single family home? Right? Like, okay, there's absolutely no reason in the world why we can't ban this. And there's no discussion of it whatsoever. I mean, I could be wrong. I think RFK Jr. has discussed something along these lines. I'm not super familiar with exactly what that is, but the fact that isn't an obvious thing to be at minimum discussing, because who's not going to support that?
The corporation.
That would get support of almost everyone, left or right. I mean, who is not? What ideology except for the most free marketeer people. But even they don't necessarily think that, because they want markets that function. They don't want monopolies. And BlackRock buying up houses is monopoly practice. It's not.
Yeah.
Not market functioning in any kind of free manner.
But I think that's the answer, is that these are large corporations, and so therefore they're not going to be touched by the political class because they probably don't.
Well, it's weird. Okay, but here's the part that is super weird, and it tells you how much people buy into the propaganda that they're fed, and we're just sort of supposed to think things are not that big of a problem, right, or they are a problem, but we can't do anything about it, where we know that corporations basically run our government. We know massive billion-dollar corporations run not just the state governments, but the federal government, okay? And if anything, there probably are several state governments that are more well-run than the federal government, really, and that's something else to discuss. But their influence is by far and away the largest decision maker in what actually gets done. And is that a democracy? Is that a liberal democracy? I don't think it is. Now, has America been like this? The critique that when I've had these kind of debates with more mainstream, let's call them like left liberal historians, they'll say, okay, well, America was always like that. At least it's always been like that post the Industrial Revolution. And there's something to that. I mean, that's not an unfair position, but that doesn't change the fact that it actually has gotten a lot worse over the last 50 years. At minimum, we're going back to a 19th century level of, Gilded Age level total corruption, where the wealthy, are basically have everything handed to them that they desire. Their lobbyists get practically everything that they want, and there's very rarely a time where the populace can actually check their power. And so, in my view, that's not a democracy, okay? And we should want a democracy. In my view, that is a corporate tyranny. I've used that word several times in Tablet. I use it very specifically. I don't use it just to be inflammatory. From my perspective, we live in a corporate tyranny. This is not a democracy. So all this hand-wringing about whether or not Trump is going to end democracy. Okay, well, end what? What democracy? I mean, and there's two ways of looking at this that is a little bit more complicated, but my argument would be that there are democratic forms that function in this country still, that you could use to try to reform the system. So I think when you introduced me, you said, I don't think the system is reformable. I think it's reformable through a very specific plan, coordinated plan of action that is off the beaten path.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So did Michael? Okay. I didn't realize he had
found an article that's for the public to watch.
Okay, so can people see the same thing we're seeing? Can the audience see that?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't realize Mike had used that term. He probably used it before me. I might have used it before that. I don't remember, but it doesn't necessarily matter. We're of a like mind. I love his works. I love all of his work. So,
and if I may, some of the professors I interviewed, I would say, well, do you think it's so bad we'll go to civil war? And about 25% were kind of open to that. But a larger percent said, no, going to civil war, that's too much for America. And I go, well, does it get better? And they go, well, no. And I asked, and about 3 or 4 of them said, we're not going to go to civil war. That's ridiculous. And I go, are we going to get better? And he goes, no, that's ridiculous. And I go, so where are we going? And they go, this scared the hell out of me, because 3 or 4 of them said that, and they did not coordinate with each other. These were independent people who came up with this answer on their own, and they literally said what you just said, except they used the word Brazil. We're going to descend to a Brazil-level democracy, and we'll just stay there for the next 30 to 40 years.
So Michael Lynn wrote that a couple years ago.
Really?
And yeah, Michael Lynn wrote that like 2 or 3 years ago, and I think I actually quoted him as saying that in one of my pieces because I interviewed Michael Lind, I think, in the piece that's called "Americans Hate Each Other." But I think Michael Lind has made that argument for a while that we're far more like Brazil, and we're going to move to be much more like Brazil in terms of just kind of the chaos. And what he means by that is, and Brazil is the closest analog in terms of immigration patterns, a very large former European colony in the Americas.
Sure.
And his argument for quite a while has been, at least the last couple of years, has been that we're far more like Latin America than people want to think. People want to compare us to Western Europe or other, major, very wealthy, industrialized countries. But that's not a great comparison, that we're much more like Latin America. And I'm going to extend that argument, okay? And my argument is that we're essentially very, very similar. We're basically an Anglo version of Latin America that just ended up being very, very lucky. And if you think about our luck, like our system is not that well designed. I mean, it was incredibly well designed for the time that it originally, in 1887, right? But it is so out of date. Most of our ascent. What's that? Good.
You're going to upset a lot of white people because I'm here in California.
Everything I write upsets people. I mean, it's not.
I'm just saying, I totally agree. As a Latino, I asked my grandma, my abuela, why are all the Mexicans here? And she goes, because America invaded every single Latin American country and destabilized them. The only one that they didn't was Costa Rica, which is the only one that American corporations like to go to. And that's why they're all basket cases with a high group, a ruling class that run everything and have all the money, and then a massive amount of poor, because those were the people who were held over from when America invaded and said we need an elite junta to run the whole thing. To hear you say it's just America wasn't that, because a lot of people go, oh no, we're different. We're fundamentally different. We put ourselves right here because we're not Latin. Right. And saying, well, no, you just got lucky. And it is kind of fitting that you're turning into a Latin American democracy. I thought we're doing that for the last.
Well, pseudo democracy, right? I actually think. Well, so I would argue that actually a lot of Latin America, so Central and South America, are becoming, with the exception of probably of Brazil. Although again, I actually don't follow these things that closely, but my impression is that a lot of South America and Central America, including Mexico, right, which is Central America. I don't think anyone would call it North America. I mean, maybe some people, but in any case, it's some of these distinctions are a little hard sometimes. So I would argue that Central and South America, a lot of it is actually becoming more democratic, like genuinely democratic, for exactly the type of reasons that you were alluding to. That, okay, so in some respects, the Obama administration, and I don't think I'm the first person to make this argument. In fact, somebody made it, but I forget who it was. The Obama administration, in many respects, kind of signaled the end of the Monroe Doctrine, where they could no longer do the things that you were just mentioning, where they couldn't just overthrow the government in Guatemala or the government in Brazil at whim, and no one could really do anything about it, and only rumors would come out, and then people would act like you were a conspiracy theorist because you were pointing out that they overthrew the Chilean government or the Brazilian government or the Guatemalan government or many other governments, right? In Central and South America, they can't do that, and some of that is a function of modern multimedia and the fact that there are cameras everywhere, and that we can read Latin American news. I mean, how many people were actually reading, having any exposure to actual Latin or South American news sources 50 years ago, right? So it was much easier to do these things. So I would argue that in many instances, a lot of South and Latin America is becoming better run, or at minimum, it's becoming genuinely more democratic. And we're becoming less democratic. So they're becoming more like what we used to be, and we're becoming more like what they used to be. Fascinating. That's what I would argue. And I mean, and I think some of that is just a function of our total arrogance. Like, we don't think we need to change anything. And if you have hubris.
You're saying America's arrogant?
Yeah. You think? Right. Right.
We'll let this guy on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Indeed.
Okay.
Lots of people have that attitude.
We're going to get to the main meat and potatoes because we did a great warm up. I just have to add, I generally agree with you about Obama and the end of the Monroe Doctrine. Okay. However, he and Hillary directly overthrew the government of Honduras. I think in 2014, they managed to keep it away from the American people because it was a small country, and they overthrew them democratically in line with the Monroe Doctrine and the overthrow of the other.
Well, I'm not familiar with it. I mean, I'm not going to challenge you on
because
any
they
of
didn't
that
talk about it.
I'm not familiar with it, so I don't have any comment. But I mean, I don't doubt it. So I mean,
And then there was
surprise me.
There was also 3 different Latin American leaders caught a bizarre form of cancer and had to step down. And those were 3 governments that were challenging the Obama administration at the time. We can't prove anything, but it was kind of bizarre that the top 3 Latin countries challenging or pushing against Obama, every single one of them had a bizarre form of cancer all at the same time and had to step down and have another political leader take over. But that's neither here nor there. I want to get into the main meat.
Well, it's interesting. You'll have to send me information about that because I'm not super familiar with it.
Yeah, because they tried.
I'm not familiar with it.
Well, because the media painted Obama as great for Latinos, and they wouldn't talk about it internally. Like a lot of Latinos did not like Obama, but you never hear that on the news because he.
Oh, sure, yeah, right.
He deported more people than ever. I remember going to rallies in Los Angeles. And all the Latin people were yelling and screaming at Obama for his horrible anti-immigration policies. You turn on the TV, a bunch of happy minorities going, everything's great. Obama's great. Everything's great. And I'm like, well,
I mean, it's because Obama was their hero. Obama was exactly what they want their president to be, right? Obama is the most, I mean, in the history of the U.S., you'd have a harder time coming up with a more superficial assessment of a leader and motivation for a leader than Obama. So going back to one of the things you said, so you introduced that I worked at Air America and I witnessed this.
Yeah.
Okay, so the night that I was working at Air America in 2004, I think it was either the night or the morning after. I think probably both, actually. The night of Obama's famous 2004 speech, right? The big one that launched him into national attention, the convention speech, the keynote in 2004. And I came back into Air America and I sat down because I was writing news, and I sat down across from my boss, who was the news anchor, and I said, he's going to be president. I said, that guy's going to be president. Mark my words, he'll be president. And she said, oh, come on. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I said, he's the Black Bill Clinton.
Yep.
I said, he's the Black Bill Clinton. He's going to be president. And I think that is a correct assessment of the man as could possibly be. Just like Clinton, he was a neoliberal. He did almost nothing that the big business or Wall Street didn't want. It's shocking how right I ended up being. And that was just based off of one speech.
Yeah, which is ironic because a lot of people weren't sure. I remember my father, my biological father was in the military during Vietnam. He didn't go to Vietnam, but like many of the veterans from that time, he's super jaded about America, basically stopped voting. And when he saw Obama give that one of the first speeches at the DNC, he goes, that guy's going to be the next president. My father hasn't voted since 1978. And he goes, it's time, and he talks well. And so there was certain.
Well, he's got a lot of charisma, right? I mean, charisma goes a long way. I mean, so going back to how I knew Trump would never win. I mean, there's a lot of things. And the main reason why I knew, Trump would win. The main reason why I knew Trump would win in 2016, and I bet everyone who would bet me money on it, is I knew. And actually, when I was working at Air America, so this was 14 years before, right? Or no, whatever. So 12 years before, I bet everybody there that Hillary would never be president. Because if you're from Middle America, you know that there's not a worse candidate you could run.
Right.
There's not anyone who symbolizes all the things that people in the middle of the country detest about coastal culture more than Hillary Clinton. So my logic was anyone can beat Hillary Clinton. The more charismatic candidate generally wins. If you look at American history, try to find an election where the more charismatic candidate did not win. And
Right.
I think you probably got the 2020 election, right? Because Trump is definitely super charismatic, and Biden was already old at that point. So you have the 2020. What other elections are there where the more charismatic candidate doesn't win?
I don't know.
There aren't very many.
But let me
usually in American politics, the more charismatic candidate wins. At least in terms of like a presidential election. If we're talking about a small election where people don't actually get exposure to someone's speaking style, they don't have a lot of we could probably find things in the 19th century because, of course, we're talking pre-even radio. But in the modern era, the more charismatic candidate wins, which is probably why Trump will almost certainly win again.
The only one I can think of in the modern era, going to what you're talking about, where the less charismatic character won, was the 2020 election. And I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories.
I can't think of any others myself. I mean, off the top of my head.
No, I can't.
Who was running against Eisenhower? Eisenhower wasn't super. Well, I think it was Adlai Stevenson.
Adlai Stevenson, who was not charismatic.
He wasn't super charismatic. Neither was Eisenhower, but that's all pre-TV, though.
Yeah, Eisenhower looked good in a suit, though, and he had that general picture, so that's kind of.
Well, yeah, he's a general, right? So that's a certain level. That's a certain kind of charisma. Yeah, right, exactly. And we love our military in this country.
Adlai Stevenson was like this in a photo, like he was kind of a professor, lanky. So,
right.
I want to get to the Civil War stuff, but before I do,
sure.
Air America was a news station, and then it became politically polarized. Is that fair?
No, it was always a political project. So, I mean, I was involved on some level, like mainly just trying to get involved very early on in it because, I started out on the left. I used to think of myself as a radical socialist. I went to the most left-wing school, literally in the English-speaking world. And then
Berkeley?
once I saw, what's that?
UC Berkeley?
No, York University, which is in Toronto, and everything in Toronto is way more left-wing. I mean, like Canada, nothing like. In fact, I would argue that what's happened to American universities is the Canadianization of the universities. Like Canadian universities have been dramatically more radical, dramatically earlier. So like the school that I went to 25 something years ago, or whatever it was the first exposure I had to like the absolute lunacy of the academic left. And that kind of inspired me, because I still thought of myself as a leftist, to try to figure out a way to reach the public. And I'd done a bunch of journalism in college, and so there were these kind of, I wouldn't say rumors because they were factual. There was this buzz that someone was going to try to create a radio station that was the Fox News of the left.
Right.
And I thought that was a good idea at the time. Now I think it's horrible, right? Because we have it. It's called MSNBC. And at the time, right.
I was there.
So I thought it was a great idea at the time. And so I really was determined to get involved. I was an intern because I was still young at the time. And I was I think one of their first interns, maybe even their first intern. They put me in the newsroom because they said that was where I would get the most experience, which I didn't like at the beginning, but I ended up really liking once I got to be there. I wrote news stories. One of the only legitimate things of actual journalism they did at that station. Most of it was just these kind of pseudo SNL style things on the radio where they would play out these skits, but they were obviously entirely politically charged. And the whole thing from top to bottom was basically Democratic Party propaganda, trying to be like comedic Democratic Party propaganda. And I very quickly thought it was ridiculous and insane. And it so much so that I wanted to get out of New York completely, because everybody I was around, both in NYU, practically in journalism school, they were all just middle of the road establishment neoliberal Democrats, everyone. And occasionally you would meet like the neoliberal Republican who kind of, middle of the road centrist Republican in the media industry,
Rarely.
but not very often. The circles, even back then, even 20 something years ago, they did not cross over. There was no debate whatsoever. I've never lived anywhere that had less debate inside like a general bar discussion or anything else than New York. Never. And this was 20 years ago. And so I just found it just incredibly stifling and boring as hell. And so that motivated me not only to get out of Air America, but kind of go on this journey of self-discovery that eventually led me back to doing a PhD. But it was always propaganda, essentially. It was supposed to be like entertaining. But literally when I wrote the newscasts at Air America, and this was, again, the only supposedly detached portion, they were read at the top of the hour. My news anchor, and I tell this story in class because I've taught, for more than 10 years at 4 universities. And so I'll tell this story in class because I think it's good for students to hear, that I was literally told by the news anchor when pitching stories, if it doesn't hurt George Bush, if it doesn't help John Kerry, if it doesn't hurt the Republican Party, if it doesn't help the Democrats, I don't want to hear about it. Don't pitch me the story. Yeah. The wording might have been slightly different. It might have been like a little softer, but it was exactly that line of thought. They didn't even want anything in the newscasts that were between the hour to not be completely slanted towards that. And I that was literally what was told to me, because I was always pitching stories about labor unions and like things having to do with the workplace, because I thought that's what mattered, and I that's what I wanted to write about.
Traditional liberal topics.
No, yeah.
Wow. So they didn't even want you covering traditional liberal topics. It was all slam journalism. Like, hey, I want to talk.
It was all just basically, how does this help? How does this help John Kerry, who at the time, right, obviously was the presidential candidate, and how does it help the Democratic Party? And it was essentially like feed red meat to the audience. And in their defense, I think some of it was audience capture, right? I think it was that they thought that this is what the audience wanted, and maybe they had polling or something to back this up. And there certainly was a lot of, this is back when there were call-in shows and things like that. There's a lot of callers coming in. Yeah. So I don't know where exactly that dictum came from. I have suspicions, but I won't say people's names. But it doesn't really matter, because anybody who listened to the station shouldn't be surprised at this. I mean, it was so obviously just as a kind of not exactly very skilled attempt to create propagandist material. But most of the people that I worked with who went on to have careers, they went on to totally mainstream outlets, or they went on literally to MSNBC. Many of the people I worked with went on to jobs at the New York Times. And what's funny is, at the time, most people thought Air America was kind of like this ridiculous organization, which it was, but the media became Air America, right? Like, Air America was a prelude to what most of the mainstream media became, which is wild to have been there and to see now that that's what's taking place.
That's what I wanted to hear. I'm not going to touch that. That just saddens the hell out of me. Let's move on. If you're not laughing, you're crying, right? As I was telling somebody, they're like, why do you do these interviews and you laugh after someone says Civil War? And I'm like, because if you ain't laughing, you crying doing this. I mean, it's like,
exactly.
Exactly.
No, it is sad. I love journalism. That's part of the reason why, I do it. It's certainly not for the money. But I've always been a big believer that great things can be accomplished with journalism. So it is really sad to me to see so many people buy into the concept that just this, partisan cheerleading and beating up on the groups in the country that you don't like. And this isn't just the left that does this. The right does the same thing. I mean,
of course, yes. Fox News does this.
It's not just the left-wing people. I mean,
Yes, of course.
Both spheres are doing it. So I don't find that. I don't think that's journalism, right? I think it's not helpful.
Children. And like I said, there used to be one child in the room, and then they go, "No, we want to compete." Now it's all children in the room. Children arguing children. We have no more adults arguing with each other. And they're like, "Well, if you're going to talk like a child and yell and scream, I can do that too." Great.
And the child talk is getting worse though too, right? I mean, everything is shorter. It's all TikTok culture.
Yeah.
YouTube has effectively become kind of like TikTok, right? I mean, when you go on YouTube, it's mostly shorts now, or at least a lot of it is shorts. So it's not only childish, but then it's the attention span is getting, how long is the average TikTok? It's probably like 30 seconds. I would be almost positive that 5 years from now it'll be 20 seconds, and then 5 years after that it'll be 15 seconds.
Okay, we talked to some media literacy people, and they completely agreed with what you said. So I don't want to go down that horrific topic.
Sure,
we'll stick to one.
I got lots of predictions. So
one more story a day, please. I have to live. Okay,
right.
Yeah, I'm a human. I've thought the same. The thing that I was so fascinated about meeting you was that I've come to a lot of the same conclusions. It doesn't work. It's not working. Mm-hmm. The breakdown's coming inevitably. I just hope we can do it as peacefully as possible. It's not something that I'm celebrating, but it is something I've come to recognize will happen. And like you said, do we not talk about how we're developing a cancerous tumor? Do we just, oh, that's depressing. Yeah. Let's just go ahead and let it grow to the sides of it's like hanging off the side of her head, like in some country where they don't have medicine. That's ridiculous. To enter that subject, I'm going to show the audience the top.
But I want to flesh that metaphor out a little bit. So the metaphor though is, so while we do have a tumor that is growing, and this should hopefully bring it up to bear, is the tumor is going to kill poor and working class people. Rich people, and this is why they don't care, because money always talks. I mean, all you have to do is look at like the failure of the Soviet when the Soviet Union finally fell. Okay, so the oligarchs who actually crashed the Soviet Union, maybe some of them faced serious consequences, but a lot of them actually were the people who were involved corruptly with the West in selling off all these state industries, and then they became the billionaire oligarchs. So the people who actually were responsible for destroying the Russian, through this obscenely ideological project in the Soviet Union, were not the people who paid the price. At least, I mean, I'm sure some of them did, but not a lot of them. And so that's the problem. Part of the reason why you can't get elites motivated to do anything, because they don't care. It's benefiting them tremendously. And if it all comes crashing down horribly, they're pretty confident that they're going to benefit in that case too.
Yeah. And they can move
right, because they'll take all the money out before it's too late.
That's what I'd heard, is that capital flight, that the elites could, let's say America gets blown up, they can easily take all their money out of foreign bank accounts and just travel to Switzerland, Hawaii, the south of France, someplace really nice. It's hard for you and me to grab all our money and our family and move. If you're super wealthy, you already have foreign properties. You already have.
Oh, it's infinitely money makes me. I mean, as somebody who's moved across the country 5 times in 6 years, money solves all kinds. I mean, you can literally hire people to pack up your house, which, I mean, the stress of just that alone. You can move on all your assets instantly, right? You don't have to worry about finding a new job, all kind of money. Money allows convenience in the craziest of circumstances. So of course, yeah, they're not really worried, right? And that's where you have to try to figure out a way to motivate working people, working poor, the middle class, to realize they're the ones who are going to get even more screwed, and that they're already being screwed if they don't come up with a plan to try to, stave off the worst of the worst.
That's, yeah. Yes.
I mean, I think that's the way to argue for it, is that the people who are actually responsible, and 2008 is a classic example, right? None of the people who actually crashed the economy, or at least very few,
right,
were held responsible. In fact, many of them got bonuses.
Yep. Only one guy was put in jail, and he was a low-level person. All the rest of them got off.
Sure, a scapegoat. Yeah, right.
And then the FBI investigated all the low-level people who did the home loans. So the people who actually had the capital, there was no investigations, but the people who were giving out the home loans, who were like lower middle-class people, primarily Latinos and African-American people, the FBI did investigate them and did put those people in prison. So the small middle-class people who were part of it got punished. The elites got absolutely nothing, no investigation at all. And it was called A Good Day for Justice. And that was during Obama, the good president.
Well, I mean, people didn't buy it. But see, yeah, people didn't buy it, though. People were angry at the time, both left and right. But again, there's no plan. And so this is the thing, I mean, is you have to have a coherent plan of how you're going to actually change things. And one of the things for me, because I've studied political culture, essentially my whole adult life on some level, or literally taken part in political culture, right? Because I was a communications director for an elected official, worked in the media. And I'm just shocked at how incoherent people's plans are, how they don't have any kind of plan to actually do anything productive or get what they want. And so that's where it goes back to the concept of secession movements. Secession is going to be the first step. I mean, because the way I've explained it to people, I don't know if I wrote about it in these pieces this way, but when I talk in conversations, and I probably said this to you when we talked earlier, is look, if you're, and I know I already used the Soviet Union as an example, but I'm going to go back to it. If you're living in the Soviet Union in the mid to late 1980s, and you ran people, if you're thinking, okay, we need to reform the Soviet Union, we need to reform this system. It's certainly not working. People aren't happy with it. It's obviously incredibly corrupt. Okay, that's pretty damn similar to the position that we're in. But if you were the reformer in the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc, Romania, any of the old former satellite states, like obviously East Germany, and you're saying to yourself, okay, well, how I'm going to reform it is I'm going to run somebody for premier of the Soviet Union, or I'm going to run somebody for chancellor, and we're going to get this like rogue campaign. We're going to try to persuade people. No, the system's all rigged, man. Like you're not going to become the Soviet premier. And it's like unbelievable that people think that this is possible. This is a two-party cartel. They control everything. Look at what's happened with RFK. He's polling in many polls, or at least he was at one point as high as 20%. 20% is amazing. That is an incredible figure. And they can't get on the debate stage. I think more states will be successful than not in keeping him off the ballot. If you can show that 20% of the people support you in a country with 350 million people, and you can't get on the debate stage, the media treats you like you're just a kooky wacko, right? I mean, what are most of the headlines that are used for RFK Jr.? They're anti-vaxxer, something demeaning, nothing that has anything to do with his actual record, like an environmental lawyer and things like this. It's a cartel. It's a cartel. We don't have control. They have almost all of the control. If you're going to fight a cartel, you need a very realistic, coherent plan. The people who fought the one-party cartel in the Soviet Union did not run for premier of the Soviet Union or chancellor of East Germany, okay? They did not, that is not what they did. They said, let's break off East Germany. Let's break off Estonia. We want local control. We don't want to be under this umbrella anymore. Okay, now East Germany had already broken off, so that's not a great example.
I get what you mean.
But, Ukraine, places like this, right? It's very hard for a government to argue if you can prove that, say, California wants to be independent and wants to run itself, and you can show poll after poll, and then you can have plebiscites that people vote on and show they want to be independent. That's not an argument, especially on the world stage, that you can win. You're going to have a hard time keeping those people in check. I mean, Quebec, you had 3 major votes for Quebec secession, but ultimately the Quebecois, this is in the 1990s, I'm sure you're familiar with. Right. Ultimately, the Quebecois, they voted to stay inside Canada, but they voted to stay inside Canada because they got a better deal, right? Like they got concessions. So the same thing would probably happen for California. If you have a real strong secession movement and California says we want to secede, at the very minimum, California should get something like a deal where they have far more senators, right? I mean, it's insane that California has 2 senators and Wyoming has 2 senators. California, which has 40 million people, and Wyoming that has more cows than people, have the same number of senators. This is insane.
That's interesting you say that. So maybe not full secession, but some sort of increased sovereignty. Like you said, concessions like Quebec and Scotland did. Is that possible?
Yeah, right. And exactly. Quebec and Scotland are great examples. They both got lots more power, arguably too much power. I mean, if I was living in the other parts of Canada, I would think Quebec probably has too much power. But at the same time, that's how a negotiation works. And you can't ever get any kind of leverage until you threaten the worst of the worst. So, even for, like, if I was involved in the California secession movement, that would be my argument. You threaten at minimum secession, and then you say get 15 senators or whatever your goal is, which is probably warranted. California has 40 something million. How many million is it? 45, 43, something like that.
Yeah, 40 million.
40 million people. Okay. It should have a hell of a lot more senators.
Yeah.
At minimum. Yeah. At minimum. 10, 15, maybe 20 senators. And people on the right are going to say, oh, absolutely not. Look, do you want it to be a democracy or not? And if we don't, and if we just want to stay under this same system where the federal government has, basically veto power via the Supreme Court over state legislation, because that's how the system has evolved, which is not how the system was intended, but that's how it's evolved. Okay, if that's the case, California has to have more senators. New York has to have more senators. Texas has to have more senators. Otherwise, this isn't even remotely democratic. And we also need a multi-party system. We can't have a system where we just have these 2 corporate parties. And you have to have a plan for how you're going to get that.
I agree. I just want to run something by you. So there was a study by the Independent California Institute. It came out about 2 months ago, and it made the news. It's very interesting because it relates to what you said. Now, this study got a lot of attention in the press because they said 58% of Californians said they were ready to peacefully secede. And that got the news. However, 68.
When was it taken?
I'm sorry?
When was it taken now? What year?
About 2 months ago, maybe 3 months
wow.
ago.
Wow.
Yeah, that's why it got in Newsweek, because it was a very new survey coming out before Trump might be president again, showing 58 or 2/3 were supporting it. What also got me was that 68% said that California would be better off now if California negotiated a special autonomous status, not secession. So 58% for secession, 68% Well, basically what you just said. Don't leave. Have some sort of increased sovereignty. Get stipulations from that. I found that
Well, I
interesting.
mean, to be fair, so just so the audience can understand what my argument is, I don't know exactly how a new federal structure, should shake out, in part because all of it's going to depend on movements like yours, where if you get enough power, then you have some kind of negotiating power of what you want. Like if my position is, and I imagine it's yours too, is if people actually want secession, that's what they should get. But if they would prefer a negotiated new agreement with the federal government, they should get that also.
Right.
So I would never argue for. I mean, my argument is, and could you pull up a map of the U.S. so I can just kind of, so I can point out what I think would actually work in terms of like new federal arrangements, because people get confused about this. I've mentioned it several times in my writing, and it's more just hypothetical. Obviously, getting to this place is not necessarily easy, but not as hard as people think. And when you realize like we're living through the death of a very corrupt empire that will eventually either collapse completely of its own weight, or people will push for reform before that. Okay, so yeah, if you can make it a little bigger, that'd be good. But okay, so it's not that hard to actually create regional confederations. I know people, that's a loaded word in the U.S., so maybe we'll just use new nation states. Okay. Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada. I think that would be a smart new federal state where they have where they each maintain their own state legislatures, but then they have some kind of new federal constitution. Those states have enough in common that I think you could have a constitutional convention and people could agree on it. Okay. Montana, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. Now, Colorado, New Mexico, maybe they don't want to be part of that because their politics are a little bit different than the other states that I mentioned. But that to me seems like but I think you could even expand it to the Dakotas, probably Nebraska, and that grouping, whether or not Colorado, New Mexico want to be part of it, that's another federal new nation state where they could have a constitution of some sorts between them, and then again maintain their state legislature. So I wouldn't argue, unless it's something like Greater Idaho, for new borders. Maybe other people, I mean, if people want that, then they should have it. Okay, so then you look at Texas. We all know Texas is going to be its own thing. Okay?
Yeah.
Having lived in Texas for 7 years, we all know they want to be an independent nation again. We all know that they're going to be an independent nation again. If you live there, the people will constantly remind you of this. It comes up all the freaking time. Okay, and I'm sure that there are polls that you just showed similar to the one that you just gave for California. They definitely exist for Texas. Okay, so does Texas take Oklahoma with it? I don't know. That probably more up to Oklahoma if they want to. But Texas is going to be its own thing. Arguably, Texas could take Oklahoma and Kansas with it, but I think more than likely Texas wants to be its own thing. So then you go to the old Confederate, okay, and you start with Florida, which maybe could easily, Florida could be its own nation all by itself. It's got enough wealth. It's got enough people. That could happen. But let's include Florida in this new other national configuration. Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, and now the Carolinas. Now Virginia is where you get thorny. Okay, right. Virginia would probably have to be divided somehow, because obviously the politics are pretty different in Northern Virginia versus Southern Virginia. But so let's say Southern Virginia goes along with them, right? And I would say West Virginia probably too. All right. Then that's another nation state of sorts that can probably have a constitution that they agree on, and they keep their state legislatures. Then you have the Rust Belt. Minnesota, Michigan, I would think probably Iowa would want to be in there, but Iowa could join the previous kind of Mountain West Plains state that I talked about with Montana and Wyoming. So Iowa's kind of an up for debate about where they would probably want to do. But I'm guessing they're probably going to want to be part of the Rust Belt just because of their demographics. So Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and now you get to Pennsylvania. Now, Western Pennsylvania has different politics than Eastern Pennsylvania.
I've heard
quite
that.
different. Okay, so Pennsylvania would probably have to be split up. All right, so you do get to a couple of states where there's a pretty distinct, regional differences. Okay, are they going to care that much? I'm not sure. I'm not that familiar with Pennsylvania politics, but I think you could probably split it up. And Western Pennsylvania is part of this Rust Belt nation state, but probably upstate New York wants to be part of that too, right?
Yeah.
And then you're left with a kind of New England where you have Southern New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, etc., right? And probably, what Delaware and Maryland want to do. Do they want to be part of the Southern thing, or do they want to be part of the Northern thing? There are some areas that are where it's a little thorny, right? But not that many. People act like it's this like incredibly difficult thing to figure out. Okay, that was all 50 states. If I forgot a state, obviously I forgot about Alaska and Hawaii. Okay, but Alaska is a beautiful, wonderful place with lots of resources. If in this kind of dividing up between new nation states, people are going to want Alaska. It's not like it's not going to have the pick of the litter in terms of where it wants to go.
Right.
It doesn't border anyone anyway, right? So same for Hawaii. They're going to have the pick of the litter. Does Hawaii want to be part of the California, Oregon, Washington thing? I would bet yes. That'd be my bet. Okay. And my bet would be that Alaska would want to join the Idaho, Montana, Utah, Rocky Mountain thing. That would be my bet.
Well, let me ask you though, because I get what you're saying. When we read a lot of articles about political divorce, national divorce, I know exactly what you're talking about. The sentiment is, you silly people, America's so complex and interconnected, it would be impossible to break us up. And I think what you're saying is, there are a few thorny states, but they're the minority. The majority of American states can easily be separated. Is that fair?
And also because I study immigration patterns and actual like national origin immigration patterns, I didn't base that division off of nothing. I'm basing it also off of immigration patterns of who settled where. Okay, so I didn't pull that out of my butt. Okay, that was thought through. I thought it through when I made those regional divisions. All right, this is where different ethnic groups have settled. All right, and also they share politics. Like if you look at their political patterns, they're pretty similar. I mean, yes, I would actually say the hardest areas to figure out where they go are New Mexico and Colorado.
Possibly.
I don't actually think the rest of it is that hard. I mean, upstate New York has totally different politics than the city and the major metro, highly populous areas. If you talk to people from upstate New York, they've wanted to be outside. They wanted to be in a different state for a long time. Yeah. I think it's pretty similar to. I think Western Pennsylvania is pretty similar. I don't think they identify that much with Eastern Pennsylvania. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was originally two Virginias.
North and south.
Three Virginias, obviously there's two Virginias now. There's West Virginia.
You have to look up my history.
I forget the exact history, but it's in Richard. What's his name?
Kreitner.
Yeah, Kreitner's book.
And then Francis Buckley. and Stephen Marsh.
You're right. They both talk about it. Okay, so you have a few states where you're probably going to have to divide them up, but not that many, man. For 50 states, that's what, 4. I mean, it's not that many. And I think part of it is because people can't actually conceptualize the country. Like, people don't have an actually full understanding of ethnic patterns, of immigration patterns, of regional identities. But I mean, that's the advantage for somebody like me, that I've lived. I mean, I didn't travel. I've lived in 9 states. I've taught at 4 universities. I've been all around this country. Okay, like, there are identities.
Well, let me get to that. First, I just wanted to point out that why is it so hard for people to do this, to figure out how America could be broken up? Here's an article from Newsweek, maybe a conscious uncoupling to go. And they were roughly talking, here's the blue states lined up, and here's the East Coast lined up.
Can you scroll down? Because from my view, I can't see it. Can you scroll down? There we go. Okay. Yeah. But that's Canada. Why are they including Canada in this?
Well, this was their, all the lefties in Canada and America get together and do this. I don't really want to talk about the specifics.
Canadians don't want that. Having lived in Canada, Canadians don't want that.
Fair enough. But I wanted to ask you, though, because you had a great insight on why do we have intelligent, informed people say there's no problem, it's fine, and you go, because they're doing well. So why is it so hard for Americans to be able to see how easy it would be to separate the states? Why is it the American proclivity to go, oh my God, that's a complicated. We'll never be able to do. Why do we immediately do that when it's obviously not true?
Well, because they don't understand it. Okay, so I mean, I've spent my entire adult life trying to understand America, and it's included, as I said, living in 9 different states and living in Canada, living in Germany. So I studied in Canada, studied in Germany, and my focus for my entire adult life has been to try and figure out what America is, what's wrong with it, what are the limitations of it, and how do you change it? That's my whole life, is trying to figure out those questions. Okay, so the first question is what it is, and you have to have a very sober assessment to try and understand a country which is has as much propaganda around it. Okay, people do not understand the country in a way because there's all kinds of enormous intellectual and cultural things that happened in the middle of the 20th century that have clouded people's view of it. So the rise of the concept of multicultural, which happens, right around mid-century, 20th century, really makes it incredibly difficult for people to understand that there are coherent cultures, right? And they basically want to say that there's only one white culture, which is insane. Okay, if you go back, so go back to the map for a second, because I actually have to go pick up my daughter. I want to leave you with this. So I only have like 5 more minutes. Go back to the map, because I think this will be illuminating for people. And I base this, I study immigration history. That's one of the things I have to write this book that I'm working on. Okay, so I can't control the cursor, but would you go over the Rust Belt? Go to the Rust Belt. Just like put your cursor on the Rust Belt. Okay, so basically from Western Pennsylvania through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, the number one source of national origin, and it's not even close, is German Americans. That used to be called the German Belt. All that used to be called the German Belt. Okay, that's German America right there. Okay, so then you go down to the Southern, like the Southern Confederate. Okay, this is English and Irish. Okay, mostly English and Irish, and once you get to Louisiana, obviously you're talking about French Americans, but that's like the only real. I mean, most of the French immigration to America went to Quebec, right? It's French Canada. Okay, so there, but I could be missing groups, but most of the South is English and Irish. Okay, that's the largest group. Now, of course, there's been a big influx of other groups. Post middle of the 20th century, once the immigration laws started to change. But obviously, these have they fought a civil war for a reason, right? There's a coherent identity, and some of it's surrounding institutions which we're very glad are gone, right? Like in slavery and Jim Crow and other things. Okay, Texas, obviously, by anyone who's ever lived there, has a coherent identity. And Texas has like California, has a mix of a lot of different immigration groups, right? It's got a lot of German Americans. It's got a lot of Mexican Americans. It's got a lot of Central Americans, okay? So Texas is German American. It also has English. It's got Latin, but it's got an identity, right? Like no matter what you want to say, it certainly has an identity. Like these groups managed to get along. They've crafted a regional and state identity. Now, when you go to the rest of the Sun Belt, right, like New Mexico, Arizona, California, obviously you've got a lot of Central Americans and Mexican Americans. They have and obviously Arizona and New Mexico have got a very big indigenous, population. Same with California, but you can say the same thing once you get into Colorado. Okay, this is sort of let's call it, for lack of a better word, a Sun Belt identity. All right. But if you were, I don't have time to go over all these breakdowns, but if you were to bring up a national origin immigration map, you would see lots of coherence between the groupings that I outlined. Okay. There is coherence. And it's because we don't actually study immigration patterns, which is pretty freaking weird, given that we are this country that is in this love affair with calling ourselves a nation of immigrants. Well, then we should study where the immigrants went and the patterns, right? Like, don't you think if we're going to be so in love with the concept that we're this like unique nation of immigrants, we should actually study where they went? Okay, so there are patterns. There is coherency. There's a reason why. Okay, so yeah, that's largest ancestry. That light blue is all German America. That's all German America, where Germans are the largest group, and you can see the Rust Belt. It's almost uniform. Look, almost every county in the Rust Belt is German American, largest percentage, and then even by Nebraska and Iowa and the Dakotas, right, and Wyoming and Colorado. Okay, all the way up into Idaho and Washington, right? So German Americans, I've got even Florida, right? So, and this is part of what my book is about, is like the disappearance of German America and how it was a very coherent campaign to try and destroy German America in the 1910s. Yep. That worked. Yep. That worked. That's what my book is about. Okay, and but so then what's the so the purple is African American, right? Okay. Yep. So yes, most African Americans in terms of like large dominant places are still in the Confederate, right? Yep. And those people don't sound and talk like African Americans from the the five boroughs of New York or San Francisco. No, they're Southerners, man. They are Southerners.
Yeah.
They are Southern rednecks, just like white rednecks, right? Hence Thomas Sowell's book. So like the concept, people always have this fantasy that those people want to live in a place that's similar to California or, Massachusetts. No, they don't. I lived in Florida. All right. I lived in Gainesville, which has a very large Southern Black population. Those people do not think like that. They do not.
It's almost like African American people can be individuals and represent regional culture instead of being some monolith, like Joe Biden said.
Right, exactly.
Like how white people have individual opinions. How strange.
Exactly.
Weird.
Precisely. They're not your pets. They have actual coherent thoughts. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Like Americans with fully developed thoughts and a history, and everything wasn't based in the South. But I have a lot. Like my family's from Texas, and it was not good to Mexicans, and some of them left. But a lot of my family stayed because there were good aspects that they liked. It wasn't just the whole culture because there's problems. It was. We see ourselves as Texans. Yeah, we're Mexicans, but we see ourselves as Texans. Right. I think you're saying the same thing with some African Americans in the South. They see.
Every regional area has far more ethnic coherence, as you can see, bringing up this map, right? Okay, and then you go to what's the largest ethnicity West Texas through large, I mean, as you can see, it's Mexican, right? Anywhere near the border, it's Mexican. Okay. So there's coherence to these things. Now, of course, California has got different politics than Arizona. That's why I didn't include those two together, right? Although Arizona's changing, right? Arizona's no longer a red state.
Right.
And so you pull up the 1880 map and you look at, that's a 2000 map, right? The one above.
Yep.
Pretty damn similar. Pretty damn similar.
You can still see the similarities. Yeah, a lot of Latinos are where they were,
except for China, except for the China part on.
That's new.
On the West Coast. What is that? Wait, what is that map supposed? Why does it say? Is this
1880?
What? I can't see it all. The news. Can you scroll down? I can't see it all.
It's just talking about major immigration groups in the 1880s.
Of 1880.
Yeah.
Well, so that's a rarity. So this is a little bit skewed because of China, because we have a minuscule Chinese American population. It's concentrated mostly in the Bay Area. It's and some other metros. It's a very Chinese Americans are really small number.
Yeah. But this backed up what you were saying about a lot of German Americans were in the center of America.
It's still the largest number. Still the largest number.
So we can.
But that's where I would say Go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
Just that we can look at the 1880s and see what you're talking about with the German immigrants throughout, and then we can go forward and we can see that it went from a few states to this is now, and the amount of German immigrants is throughout 2/3 of the Northern America region.
Right, and that's why, especially in the Rust Belt, where you can see that there are almost no counties, right, with the exception of like a few. Basically, that's Chicago. That little blip that you see on the lake is Chicago, and then there's some other blips on the lake in Michigan, but there's almost nobody there. Those aren't like super populated areas. Okay, like other than that, you can see that the entire thing is pretty much German American, right? And just as I said, as you can see in Pennsylvania, look at Pennsylvania, right? The entire thing, and Western New York. So there's far more coherence between these things than people realize. But I didn't break it up just off of this, because if you were, right, you would basically just have one gigantic German America state in the middle of the country. I broke it up more specifically, right, which is I think something I thought could work, right? Like, because I don't think the politics, having lived in the Rocky Mountain West, are the same as the Midwest. I don't think those groups would want to be together. I don't think California is the same. I think Arizona's politics are far more similar to Utah's. And I'll give you an example. I mean, obviously everybody knows that Mormons settled Utah, but their numbers are shrinking. But people don't realize their numbers are actually very large in all of the Mountain West, not just Utah, Arizona. I mean, something like 25% of the Phoenix metro is Mormon. Yep. Okay, and Idaho, super Mormon. Southern Idaho, super Mormon. Montana, lots of Mormons. Wyoming too. Western Colorado, tons of Mormons. Okay, so this is there's a coherent state you can create in a lot of these places. All right, like Kentucky, Tennessee. Those are Kentucky and Tennessee probably more liberal than, say, Mississippi and Alabama? Yes, but could they exist in a nation together where they could construct a constitution that functions? I think they could. And I think that's where we're going to get. And if we don't embrace that and try to basically reform in a much more local way, I think things could get really bad. And I don't know how long it will take to get there. It could take, I mean, we're the most powerful country in the history of humanity, essentially. So when your decline happens, when your peak is so high, your decline is probably going to be pretty long. So I don't want to act like things are going to be absolutely miserable inside of a couple of years or 5 years or even necessarily 10 years, because our peak is so big. But at the same time, our elites are so arrogant and so detached that you never know.
Do you have a map of this? Some of the audience.
I should create one. I haven't created one.
People want to see
Yeah,
the map, Duncan. Let's see the map.
I should get. I'll put it down in my notes to
Let's
get
see
it.
the map.
I got to run though. I got to
Okay.
go get my little girl,
All right.
man. I got
We'll
to. So this has been fun.
I got one question for you. Would you ever be willing to come back?
Sure.
In the future, we'll have more. Secondly, I'll send you a copy of this video. I hope you like it.
Please.
If you have any recommendations of people you know who might be willing to do an interview, they could be in academia, it could be an activist on the street. You don't have to say anything now. I'll send you an email. And I want to say thanks for coming out.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. And thanks for everybody for watching and listening.
Okay. All right. We'll let you go. And Duncan did write something on this. Watch the beginning of the episode, but we're going to.
I've written a lot of things on it. Yeah.
The tablet magazines, articles here. There's no, not that one. Here you go. That's the next Civil War. A lot of these written. Try Tablet Magazine, Duncan Moench, How the Next Civil War Begins. You can see a lot on this, and we'll have it back. Thanks for coming, Duncan. And I want to say thank you for your time. We'll talk to you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Later.